Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Moran, and I'm the CEO of Sixth and I. On behalf of our entire team, thank you for being here with us tonight. I'd like to thank The Forward for partnering with us. The Forward is the nation's oldest independent Jewish news organization. Their charge is to create a connected global Jewish community informed by a shared history, committed to justice, compassion, truth, and our collective responsibility to bridge divides. I encourage all of you to subscribe. That is such a fitting lens to approach tonight's conversation. In Can We Talk About Israel, a guide for the curious, confused, and conflicted, Daniel Sokatch, the CEO of the New Israel Fund, dives into why so many people feel so strongly about Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even though many don't actually understand the history of it very well. As an expert who understands both sides of one of the world's most complex, controversial, and nuanced conflicts, Daniel takes the common fear of even talking about Israel out of the equation by answering seemingly off-the-table questions with nuanced perspective and understanding, threading the needle still remaining accessible to people who are just starting to learn about the conflict. The book makes the case for why even those on the sidelines of the debate should care, why Israel matters, and why supporting Israelis and Palestinians working to resolve their conflict is so important, not only for the Middle East, but for America and for the world. Daniel Sokatch will be in conversation tonight with Judy Ruderin, the editor-in-chief of The Forward. She spent more than 2 decades as a reporter, editor, and innovator at the New York Times, where she served as the Jerusalem bureau chief from 2012 through 2015. Later in the program, we'll be taking some of your questions, and you can submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We're also including a link to purchase copies of Can We Talk About Israel with autographed book plates. All of that can be found in the chat box. Thank you again for joining us, and please welcome Daniel Sokatch and Jody Ruderin into your homes.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Heather, and thanks for joining us. And I'm very, very proud to say that I got 3 out of 3 on the Sixth and I trivia. How did you do, Daniel?
I bombed the Matasiasu one.
Can't even pronounce it.
Can't even pronounce his name anymore. I for sure thought it was going to be Leonard Cohen.
I mean, I have to also say, I recently took we published an article about the Chidon, the Bible quiz, which had its finals this weekend. And we published this very hard quiz from the Bible. And I only got 5 out of 10, including a lot of guessing. So I'm going to really start touting my Sixth and I accomplishment. And I'm thrilled to be back here sort of, because one of the very last events that I did before the pandemic was actually at Sixth and I in person with my friend Michael Barbaro. And I'm thrilled to be with you, Daniel. And it's great to see the crowd from all over places. Someone from right up the road here in West Orange, New Jersey. I'm in Montclair, and someone from Salt Lake City I was struck by, and Monticello. You don't always get someone from Monticello on the Zoom. So I'm really thrilled to have them. And it's great to be with you. And we'll just jump right in. And if people have questions, as Heather said, please put them in the Q&A so we can get to lots of your questions as well. So when the ask came in for this event, I was immediately like, I'm in. I love Sixth and I love Daniel Sokatch. I'm like, absolutely, I'll do it. And then the book arrived. Here it is. And I was like, oh God, really? I have to read another 300 pages about Israel? Are you kidding me? And then I open it up, and here you are writing about like all the millions of words that have been written already about this topic, and how there's so many books and articles and all the journalism and blah, blah, blah. And I started to think, it reminded me a bit about that old saying of like at a Jewish banquet where they're like, everything has been said, but not everybody has said it, right? I'm thinking that you did not write this just because you thought, well, I haven't written a book yet, that you have some other reason why this book needed to exist. And I assume you thought the world really needed this book. So please tell us, why did we need another book about Israel? And how is this one different? You say it's a guide for the curious, confused, and conflicted, which is pretty much everybody. So who's it really for? And why do we need this?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you all at Sixth and I and everywhere you are in the world. And Jody, great to be here with you. Um, I feel that I have to make a little plug after your devastatingly harsh question about why I wrote the book, to say that for those of us who care about this issue and other issues that are roiling our community, that are of interest to the Jewish community, and in fact to sort of feel like you're part of a Jewish community in this country beyond your own, wherever you go to shul or go to the community center or wherever you have Shabbat dinner or don't have Shabbat dinner, the Forward is kind of a unique institution out there. And so I just want to encourage everyone, as Heather did, to also subscribe to the Forward. Check it out online. It is the place where the conversation is happening in our community. So why did I write?
Let me make the question more nice now.
Yeah, maybe you want to rethink your tone. No, so look, and it is great to see. I see people from my part of the world, Northern California, San Francisco, signing up. So it's wonderful to have such a broad group of folks together. Look, obviously this wasn't just a vanity project. I have a great job that I love very much, and if I really want to write something, I'll just send it to your newspaper or one of the other ones. But what I felt was this: I felt that there are countless books written, as you said, about Israel, and they largely fall into two broad categories, it seemed to me. And the first category are books that are really advocacy pieces for one side or the other. And those range from pretty moderate books or advocacy pieces that really are attempting to create a sort of sympathy or empathy for one particular side of this conflict, all the way to books that are fairly blatant and honest about what they set out to do. See Alan Dershowitz's The Case for Israel. The title says it all. To books that are really polemics, even screeds. And again, I'm going to put this in air quotes for now. Both sides to this debate, or many sides to this debate, have those kinds of books: the pro-Israel narrative, the anti-Israel narrative, the pro-Palestinian narrative, the anti-Palestinian narrative. So that's big category one. There are, of course, exceptions to my two categories. Big category number two are books by experts for experts, or by scholars for scholars, or by specialists who are really drilling down into one specific part of the conflict. These are often excellent books. They often, more often than not, they avoid what I believe the trap is of the first category, but they're not particularly accessible. I wanted to write something that was neither a polemic or an advocacy piece for one side or the other, but a book that kind of lifted up both sides of the story, that honored both narratives. Although I come from a very specific place, which I am frank and clear about in the introduction to the book. I'm a product of the liberal Jewish community. I fell in love with Israel when I was 16 years old. That's a love affair that has never ended, and I wrestle with it every day on the professional and the personal level, which is an appropriate thing to do given the etymology of the word Israel in Hebrew, right? Which is wrestling with God. So I wanted to avoid that, and I wanted to write something that would appeal to people and be accessible to people who get that this is important, right? Who understand also that this is an emotional minefield full of challenges that they don't even fully understand. And this is a book for them. So, the second question I had to ask after should I write a book was, for whom am I writing the book? And not to be glib, but really for those of us who are confused and curious and conflicted, for people who are compassionate and open-hearted and open-minded, who are willing to listen, who are willing to have their assumptions challenged, who are willing to sort of wrestle with these issues as well. Even if you find yourself at the start a sort of partisan of one of the camps, if you really want to hear the whole story told from the perspective of someone who has devoted his life and career to trying to help unravel it, that's who the book is for.
I love that. I mean, I think that it is harder and harder to find someone who doesn't think they already know what they think about the kind of upshot of this. But for me, the world is like divided into two kinds of people. I mean, one, people who want to understand how other people think, even if it's just to get more emboldened in their own views or nuanced in their own views, and one who just doesn't care about what anyone else thinks. And I like to travel in the first one. So I did notice right away, I don't know how many of you at home have the book, but, and you're going to see that I actually did read it because there's a lot of like green highlights in it. But there are two things that struck me right away, starting with the cover, and going throughout, there are these like neat, interesting illustrations, maps, and other drawings, hand drawings, ink drawings. And then the other thing that struck me are these kind of gray boxes with like different kinds of writing in them, which was a little bit reminiscent of the Passover Haggadah, when you're kind of reading the text and then there's all these other things and you don't know when you're supposed to read them. But anyway, I want to start by asking you about the drawings. They're by a guy named Christopher, is it Noxon?
It's Noxon.
Noxon, not Nixon. So I'm interested in like, what's up with the drawings? Who's this guy? How'd you meet him? Why are there drawings in this book? And what do you think about why did you like his style? How did the whole drawing thing work?
Well, this was, as the book itself, an idea really that came from my my brilliant and incredible wife, who used to always say to me, you know, you should write a book about Israel. And to whom I would respond, if I wrote a book about Israel, I would call it Israel WTF. Why one small country drives so many people bonkers. Because what I was
not do that. That sounds great.
It's kind of a funny story, which I actually haven't talked about in one of these interviews, but that is what I sent let's not forget about the illustrations, but I'll just tell you, that was the title of the book proposal that I sent into Bloomsbury. And when they called me in to say that they wanted to buy the book, I said, obviously, I don't want to call it that. I mean, like, that was just a funny thing that I was thinking, and I really blah, blah, blah. And they said, oh, no, we love that title. And so we had a big argument about it. I couldn't think of a better title, but I did not want that to be the title. It was a bit too cheeky for me. And I want the book to be accessible, but not a joke. And then it was settled by the British parent company of Bloomsbury, who, in the midst of the Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party, Israel politics in Britain, which make ours look like easy by comparison, they said, you can't call it that. And so my editor and I, the publisher of Bloomsbury USA, and I came up with this new title. But the drawings were also my wife's idea. And when I had said to her, I want to write something that's accessible, right? Avoiding the two categories. She said, you should have Chris illustrate it. And Chris Noxon is a guy who I met, for those of you who are familiar with Reboot, which is a sort of network of creative and activist and people in journalism, the arts, media, culture, Jews. I was going to say young Jews. Once upon a time, we were young, but not so much anymore. It's 20 years old. So I knew Chris from the Reboot Network, and I had really loved and admired his work. He had become a good friend, and he wrote a book called Good Trouble, which I really recommend to folks who, which came out a couple of years ago, and it was Chris's wrestling and exploration of the civil rights movement and the history on a personal level in America. It's an illustrated book, brought about by sort of the advent of the Trump years. And I loved what he did there and thought that this would, again, serve to make things more accessible. When, if you're writing a book about Israel, you are going to have a lot of charts and graphs and maps. And my idea was, let's have Chris do them. They'll be friendlier. And then he sort of suggested that he do some more illustrations, and I just loved them. So every few pages you get, I think, the great pleasure of looking at a Chris Noxon illustration, whether it's a portrait of Golda Meir or a rendering of an historical event or a map or a chart or a graph. I really think that they enliven the book. And what you called the Passover Haggadah bits, which I love. I hadn't really thought about that. I called them in my head when I was writing the book sidebars. And that's how the amazing design people at Bloomsbury sort of put them into the book. I sort of love the way they did it. And those are my personal sort of stories and anecdotes.
I mean, I will admit that while I was like, second guessing myself for having agreed to do an event that would require me to read this book, I was flipping through and looking for ways to not read it. And I came across the gray boxes. And the first one I saw it's titled Eulogy, and it's your reflections on the Rabin funeral, and talks about how moved you were by his granddaughter Noah's eulogy, and so moved that you and your wife ended up naming your own daughter Noah. And I obviously found that very touching and memorable. And I guess what I wanted to ask was, so there's almost like two books here. There's the gray bits, which are almost all that in that genre of, Daniel's personal experience or really personalized take on the situation. And then there's everything else, which is, like a little bit more the official thing. And I guess I'm partly wondering, why didn't you just do the gray boxes and whatever's in between them?
Well, I think what I was trying to do, but with the exception of the illustrations, which obviously brought a whole nother dimension, was to make the reading of the book. And I apologize for making you read another book.
No, it's all right. I mean, I really
I wanted to make.
I have to say, I'm sorry. I have to admit.
I appreciate your candor. Look, I wanted reading the book to be the closest approximation of talking about Israel. This is what I do in my day job. Oftentimes, I'm out. I've spoken, I'm sure, with many of you out there listening to this. This event. I've come to your synagogues, your community centers, your universities, and we talk about Israel. And over the 12 years that I've done this job now, have realized that part of what makes communicating, look, we all know this, part of what makes communicating effective is telling stories. And when it comes to Israel, because it's so emotionally charged, because it's so fraught, and because it's so personal, I don't think you really can avoid the personal stories. And I think they help explain my perspective, right? Like you can tell, but show, don't tell. And the sidebars sort of tell you who I am and where I'm coming from. But the reason why that's not enough is because the point of the book, again, is to give the reader a basic toolkit to be able to sort of navigate this most combustible of topics. And in order to do that, I sort of feel like you want to have dessert, but you have to eat your dinner, right? You have to have your vegetables. And the first part of the book, I try to make a very digestible, appetizing dish out of. I'm going to stop with the metaphor because I don't know where it's going, the food. But you've got to look. So many people sort of feel extremely strongly about the debates today, BDS and apartheid and the settlements, and they feel so impassioned and emotionally connected to and upset about some of these issues. But they don't necessarily have the sort of step back, calmer understanding of why things are what they are. And so I think that you need to have that understanding. So that's part one, is let's all get on the same page. Part two is the deep dive into the most contentious issues of the day, right? In addition to the ones that I just said, what's going on with Christian Zionists, right? What's happening to the American-Jewish relationship with Israel? Why is it and how is it that Israelis and Palestinians put so much energy into trying to erase and obviate the other's connection to and history with the land? So you have to read part one, I think, to really appreciate part two. Then the illustrations and the sidebars hopefully keep you interested. I will just say the last part of the book is what I call a lexicon of the conflict. It's like a glossary. And my 19-year-old daughter looked at me when I handed her the finished copy of the book, and she said, "Hey, Dad, why don't you just write the lexicon?" So she was even harsher than yours, right? At least you wanted to hear the personal story.
I'm about to ask you about the lexicon.
Yeah.
It's funny because so when I came back from Jerusalem, I somewhat late in my time, I wrote an article, a column really, about something I call conflict code, and about a bunch of terms that have different meanings in this conflict than they do in plain English. And I then wrote this memo for my successor that has now been passed down to a few successors about outlining some of these terms. So the whole concept of the lexicon or the glossary really resonated with me. And I wanted to talk to you about one particular entry, because at the beginning of the book, on page 16, you say a few quick words about Zionism and talk about how you're often asked if you're a Zionist and how you feel like the question is a little bit off in today's context. And it's something I'm often asked too. I was asked it right when I got named to be Jerusalem bureau chief. I was asked it in a very public and challenging way on Twitter, and I got out of it by saying that the only ist I am is a journalist, which seemed like a decent answer at the time. But I've been thinking about it a lot lately. I found myself asking a few times since I've come to the forward, I wonder where the American Jewish community is on like whether the percentage that identify as Zionist has changed. And what I found out, I haven't done like deep research on this, but several different pollsters have told us that they don't poll on that question. That nobody's really ever really asked how many people are Zionists, because the definition of it is so fraught, and each side has kind of co-opted the definition. So in order to ask the question, you need to define it. And once you've defined it, you've kind of biased your sample. So we don't actually know what percentage of American Jews now or ever thought they were Zionists, which I think is really interesting. You did attempt to define it. And actually, I was going to say, just a couple of weeks ago, I did an event with Brett Stephen and Peter Beinart on the question of, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? And I asked them each, this was my first question to them, was how do you define Zionism? And Peter went on like this, I mean, it must have been 4 minutes of a kind of dissertation. And I was like, wow, good thing you don't work for Webster's. And then Brett had a very succinct and very different definition. And you have a very succinct one too. You say in this lexicon, which I highly recommend, that Zionism is the belief that the Jewish people should be able to establish a national homeland in the ancestral territory of Zion, what is now Israel, and the movement dedicated to realizing that belief, which is a great number of words for a definition and very clear. And I want to know now, Daniel, are you a Zionist?
So the answer to that is yes, by my definition of what a Zionist means, right? You just read it, right? But it's an anachronistic question in many ways. By the way, like the horse has left the barn, or whoever leaves the barn, the cow, like this, like my protestations that this is a kind of a weird conversation don't really matter, except for the fact that I think I'm right. By virtue of what you just said, the reason why people don't poll, about whether American Jews consider themselves Zionists is because no one agrees on what that means. No one even knows what it means, right? People have any number of definitions. So I will go to the mat to argue that the definition I provide in the book is the definition of the word Zionism, but I won't argue with people who say, well, that's not what I mean when I say Zionism, because only they know what they mean. I mean, I've often said, the vision of Israel that is described in the 13th and 14th paragraphs of Israel's founding Declaration of Independence, that Israel should be the home of the Jewish people, a place for the ingathering of the exiles, as it says in that document, and also a free and open society that ensures equality for all of its citizens, regardless of race, religion, ethnic origin, gender. That's a pretty good version of what I think Israel should be. So that's sort of my simple answer. By the way, I start another chapter of the book about what I call the other A word, anti-Semitism, by rhetorically asking, is being an anti-Zionist anti-Semitic? And I write, no, except when it is, right? Which is maybe a shorthand for Peter and Brett's conversation. But for me,
There's no shorthand for their conversation.
See, folks, aren't you glad you're talking to me and Jody tonight? So look, I mean, I think it really depends on what people mean when they use this word and they can't agree on it. The great label Fine, Leonard Fine, who some of you listening will remember, who passed away a few years ago and who was a real mentor of mine, a great progressive thinker in the Jewish world. He once called me up and he said, Sokatch, we need to reclaim the word Zionism. It's become warped beyond all recognition. And I said to him, what's the point of that? Again, that's silly. It doesn't matter. But in the end, he was probably right. I don't know that anyone would have been able to successfully do what he wanted to do. But now Zionism is like a Rorschach test, which means whatever you want it to mean.
Well, that makes it easier, I think, maybe.
Well, often it means, right, do you support Israel and its policies, right? Or sort of the inverse of that. I think that's the subtitle.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, I think it's often, I think it's basically, do you agree with me about Israel?
I think that is a great way.
Or for an anti-Zionist, it's, are you the enemy and do you hate Palestinians? I think it's like it never actually means, do you support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish nation state of the Jewish people and a democratic society that protects the rights of Palestinians? It almost never means that. But it does seem to be like, are you with us or against us? It seems to be that's mostly what people are asking, which is like not a very helpful question.
Yeah, totally agree.
So one of my very favorite parts of the book, and I believe is in a great box. I'm a big fan of the great box.
Love the great
I
box.
mean, I also like Chris's drawings, and I liked some of your words. No, I'm serious. I really like the book. I have to say, not quite as much as Steve Sheffy, who seems to really.
That was a lovely review, Steve.
It was a
Sheffy.
nice review. But anyway, I did like it.
How come you don't like it as much as Steve?
I don't think I like anything as much as Steve. He's a bit of a, he's very enthusiastic. I'm a bit of a skeptic by profession and nature. But anyway, I loved this one story you told in one of the great boxes about Brandon, an 11-year-old kid from the East Bay at the time. And Brandon, it's a great story. I'm not going to give it all away, but he essentially, you were teaching about the conflict. And at one point he said, so both guys are right and neither one really has anywhere else to go. And you said, yeah, that's pretty much, he figured it out. And I wanted to tell you a story about something that Yossi Klein Halevi, the great American Israeli author and journalist, once said to me that is similar, and will lead me to a question eventually. And what Yossi said is, he's like, look, I believe that the whole land of Israel, meaning from the river to the sea, belongs to the Jews. That is my belief. I am an Orthodox Jew. I believe that is, we were granted this as our promised land. And I'm ready to give the West Bank and Gaza and, whatever land, the 1967 borders, let's say, I'm ready to give it to the Palestinians. I want to give it to them. I want there to be two states. I want there to be peace, and I am ready to give it to them. And he said, I understand. It was right around the time that Abu Mazen had, President Abbas had said something on Israeli TV about understanding that he will never go back to Safed, to Tzfat, where he was born. And Yossi said to me, he said, I understand that for President Abbas to say that is a really big deal, that he is giving up something that he believes is his. And all I really want is for the Palestinians to acknowledge that when I give up Shiloh or Hebron or whatever, that I am also giving something up. So I want to give it up. I understand that they're giving it up and it's painful. And I want them to acknowledge that I'm giving something up and it's painful for me. And I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts on that whole thing, but I guess what it all gets to for me is one of my biggest takeaways from my time there, which is the missing empathy, or the sense that empathy is a zero-sum game. And I'm just, that's what Yossi was yearning for. He's like, I am trying to feel what they feel, and they don't seem to want to feel what I feel. And I mean, there's a million examples the other way too. I don't mean to say that's like
Sure.
The Jewish Israelis own that issue. There's plenty of Jewish Israelis that don't have empathy for the Palestinians, and et cetera. But for me, that's like at the core of the whole thing, is this lack of real empathy or any attempt at empathy. And it feels like it's impossible to make peace without empathy. And I just wonder what you think about Brandon and Yossi and empathy.
That's a really good question. It's a complicated question. Look, the first thing I want to say is I'm wrestling with whether or not I agree with you that it's impossible to make peace without empathy. I think you're probably right, and probably it's impossible to sustain peace without empathy, but I'm not sure it's impossible to make it. And
actually, I really like that edit. And I'm struck by, I think the smartest thing Yair Lapid I ever heard him say was, we're just looking for an amicable divorce. Like people do not have to get along. They do need.
And he took that line from Rabin, right, who always talked, as you know, about a divorce. Which is not to say that I don't think that the lack of empathy, as you suggest, is one of the great grinding obstacles to the resolution of the conflict. And I mean, Yossi Klein Halevi is a really good example, because he began his career, if you will, as a Kahanist, right? As like a really right-wing guy who did, by virtue of his own growth and learning and change, become a person of great empathy. And I think that's laudable and quite beautiful. I can tell you many stories about Palestinian friends and colleagues and Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Arab Israeli friends and colleagues, who also have that empathy. I mean, one of the great privileges of my work is that, everyone who's struggling for civil rights and social justice in Israel is possessed of a modicum of that empathy, right? I had the head of the leading Arab Israeli civil rights organization, which many people would consider to be like a treasonous organization. They are not in any way, shape, or form. They are, however, very critical of the status of Arab Israeli citizens. Adalah, yeah. And he once said to me, "Look, in the context of a two-state solution, a citizen of Israel, would have no problem with the law of return if there was a Palestinian state and a similar law of return for Palestinians in the diaspora. Now, this is, to my mind, not only a profoundly empathic statement, right? Something to say that does recognize something that for many of us is deeper than Yossi's yearning for Shiloh and for Hebron, but the existential terror of being a Jew in the world, right? Like, he understood why the law of return was, in my opinion, as problematic as it is, kind of legislative poetry, at least in theory, right? He got it. And I think one of the reasons I want to mention him is because there is of course, a tremendous power imbalance here, right? There's a tremendous difference between, by the way, I can see you're putting Adallah's website, which is great, but everyone be careful. Adallah in Israel is not, Adallah means justice in Arabic. And there are organizations in the States that also have that name, which have very different politics than Adallah in Israel, which is a civil rights law NGO. So just I'm sure Jody put the right one in, but just if you're doing your own research, don't conflate or confuse Adallahs that you can find in the US with the Adallah in Israel. It'd be like saying, well, I hear there's a synagogue called Kehileth Israel in Montreal, and one in New York, and one in Miami, and one in Zurich, and they must all be the same. So these are unrelated entities. But I think that the power imbalance that this guy could say that when, Yossi is on the victor's side, right? The reason he is able to say, look, I want people to acknowledge my connection to this land before we leave it is because Israel conquered it and then occupied it and then settled hundreds of thousands of its civilians in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, right? Remember, Israel's legal advisor said to Prime Minister Eshkol in 1967, whatever we do, we can't settle our civilians in this new territory. That's against the Geneva Convention. It's against international law. So the Israelis knew from the beginning, but chose otherwise. Now they would argue it's not against international law, but they made no such pretense right after the war. So the point of this is, yes, empathy is critical, I believe, but we also have to recognize the radical imbalance in power between a person who is trying to scrape together a life in the occupied West Bank and someone from the United States who's moved to Israel and who's moved into the West Bank. So I understand that might be contentious, but I just want to put that out there. Last quick word about Brandon, because I love that you picked that out, Jody, because that's my favorite of the stories in the book as well, is that it goes in classic Jewish fashion right back to me contradicting what I begun this long answer with, which was saying maybe you require empathy for the maintenance of peace, but not for what Brandon said, and I write in the book, was a child's version of what Amos Oz wrote when he said the justification for Zionism is the justification of a drowning person who swims to a plank in the sea, and that person has a right to cling to the plank to keep from drowning. And if there's a person already on the plank, they have to make room for him. And even if the second guy has to push the first one over a little bit so that he can live, that's okay too. But the first guy can't push the second guy into the sea, right?
I mean, I think I of course read that part too, and it's like so obvious when you say it like that, and it's obviously from a Jewish perspective of pikuach nefesh. It's like so obvious, like of course you cannot push the guy off. Of course you have to make room. And, I suppose sometimes the plank is like really too small for two people, but this one really isn't. So yeah. It just seems it seems so obvious and easy when you put it that way. And I'm really glad that you brought that forward. So we do have really quite a number of great questions from the audience. And I'll echo the Sixth and I folks in the chat to just say, keep them coming, but we've got a bunch. I have one more before I turn to those. Which is, you talked about the love affair that you started with this place at age 16, which is 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm just wondering why you never made Aliyah.
Again, you're eliciting from me like the stories that I don't ever tell anywhere, which is great.
That is my job.
And I was about to say, and is your job. This is what happens when you have an actual journalist interview you. True story. I'm living in Israel. It's 1994. The halcyon days of Oslo. And I actually, I could have just given such a nice parva answer to this question, but here I am telling you what happened. I had an Israeli girlfriend. I had a great job. I was loving life in Israel. And I went to the Misrad Panim, to the interior ministry offices to have the conversation with someone about what that would be like. And I don't know, 26 maybe. And I sit down, and this is Israel's so different now than it was then. I had been there to sort of extend my visa and ask other questions. So this woman sort of knew who I was, and she was very friendly, and she would always bring me a cup of tea. And I said, I want to talk to you about Aliyah, and about specifically, the choki, like the rights you would have as an ole.
Do I really get a refrigerator? Or
exactly, the fridge, the car. And she looked at me and she said, "Are you out of your mind?" And I said, "What do you mean, am I out of my mind?" And she said, "Why would you want to come here?" And so I found myself having this Zionist argument with the woman whose job it was to facilitate my questions about making Aliyah. But that really was I would say the apex of my thinking seriously about it. I then thought, like, well, that would complicate. I'm not planning on living in Israel. I'm going to go back home and go to law school, go to grad school. I don't know what my future will hold. So the moment to do this is not now, even though conversely, the moment to do this would have been then. So that's the true story.
And it never came back around to say, maybe I should actually do it?
No, I mean, I lived in Israel for a couple of years. I came home. I devoted the rest of my career to working for a better Israel for everyone there, and to help those Israelis trying to fulfill that vision. And that became a really very fulfilling life for me. And the thing is, I really love California. And there is a great Ahad Ha'am quote out there, which there's like a 30% chance I made up, but I had a T-shirt with it on the quote on it when I was in Israel. There's a 10% chance I'm misremembering that. And the quote was, Ahad Ha'am, great sort of early cultural Zionist leader, said, "We will make of our ancient promised land, a new California." And I suppose that defines the poles of my life right there.
You already have the real California, so what do you need that for? Okay.
And I work in the old one.
And when there's not a global pandemic, you get to go a lot.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm going to turn to our audience questions, and we can talk about them. So the first one is not signed, but it says, some progressive Jews, and I'm really interested in your view on this because I have had to deal with this in my profession all the time. Some progressive Jews don't only refer to Israel as Israel, but as Israel-Palestine. How comfortable are you referring to the land as Israel? And how did you decide what language to use in the book?
That's a really good question, questioner. I'm very comfortable saying Israel or Israel-Palestine. So, which if you've read the book is probably not going to surprise you that that's my perspective, right? I mean, I really do think that part of what the book is an attempt to do, and part of what I think my mission is to, as I said at the beginning, really honor both of the claims and narratives, which I don't believe are mutually exclusive to this place. So I would use those terms interchangeably, but with an understanding that sometimes the word the phrase Israel-Palestine is provocative. I don't intend it to be. So I'm mindful of that. Yeah. But in the book, as you noted earlier, Jody, and what you did in your career, right? Like part of it is trying to explain to the casual observer or reader that the words that we all are using have different meanings depending on who uses them, right? Thus, a Palestinian today refers to what? A person who lives in the West Bank or Gaza, or their descendants abroad, but also people who are Arab Israelis increasingly refer to themselves as Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Yeah, that was the next one I was going to ask you about, is what's your view on Arab Israelis, Israeli Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel?
I think you got to listen to what people say about themselves. Full stop.
That one's easier for me for the same reason.
Yeah.
All right, good. Well,
but remember, Palestinians before 1948 were the Jews who lived in that place before they became Israelis. And so these are malleable and impermanent terms.
Okay, so the next question's super easy. Elise is asking, I didn't understand why Sally Rooney wouldn't allow her book to be published in Israel. I still don't, and it made me mad. Can you speak about the BDS movement? So maybe I'll actually just give a little bit of the factual setup here, and then you can talk about the BDS movement. So Sally Rooney is an Irish novelist of great fame. She's a millennial writer, I believe. She's won all sorts of prizes, and she just published a new novel. And her first two books were translated by an Israeli publisher into Hebrew. And she decided that this one, she would not allow the Israeli publisher to translate into Hebrew because she is a supporter of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And she later clarified to say, I have nothing against Hebrew. I'd be happy to have it be translated to Hebrew if I could do that without violating the principles of the BDS movement, which are to create economic pressure on Israeli companies. So it could only be translated into Hebrew if it was not by an Israeli publisher, which, as far as I can tell, is not a realistic thing, because it would also then need the only market for a Hebrew novel is in Israel. And so that happened about a month ago, maybe a little bit less, a few weeks ago. And actually just this week, 2 days ago, I believe, we got news that Steinmatsky and another Israeli bookstore had decided to stop selling Sally Rooney's other books that were translated into Hebrew, and I believe also her books in English, kind of as a backlash against this BDS move. So that's the setup for Sally Rooney. It is probably the most pure of the kind of BDS things that have happened recently. There was quite a lot of Sturm and Drang around Ben and Jerry's decision to pull its ice cream, or they haven't done it yet, but they're going to, at the end of next year, stop selling ice cream in West Bank settlements. That is a different thing. They are not pulling out of Israel proper. They are not doing anything against Israeli companies. And there was a third one that I can't even think of right this second that I was, there's also, of course, the much more recent thing. It's not a BDS thing, but it was part of my anti-Zionism, anti-racism thing about Sunrise DC, but we'll get into that later. So I guess start with whatever you have to say about Sally Rooney, but then maybe broaden to talk about the BDS movement, which you talk about a lot in the book.
Sure. The chapter in the book I called, I think, what we talk about when we talk about BDS. That was my little homage to everyone else who uses that title. But I realized I could have used almost any of the controversial issues in part two with that formula. But about Sally Rooney, I don't know Sally Rooney. I really have liked her books. Unrelated to this controversy, I liked her latest book less than her previous two. But that's an aesthetic observation on my part. I was smiling when you were telling the story about Steinmatsky, which I hadn't heard till you told me. So thank you for that. Because of course, like, we decry BDS and boycotts, but our response to it is to boycott someone's book. But look, here's what I will say. Again, with the preface that I don't know Sally Rooney, I highly doubt Sally Rooney is anti-Semitic. I am highly skeptical that her decision to abide by the request of the BDS movement and not see the book published by an Israeli publisher was because she doesn't like or has any feelings really at all about Jews. And I'm saying this because there has been an avalanche of vitriol against Sally Rooney, a Jew hater and anti-Semite. You can oppose the policies of the state of Israel, even to the point of wanting to punish it through boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. We'll talk about that more generally in a second, without hating Jews or being anti-Semitic. You may have a limited understanding of Jewish history. You may not understand really what's going on the ground. Then again, you may. But the accusations that she's an anti-Semite seem to me to be baseless. I don't agree with her decision because I don't support boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel as construed by the BDS movement. Again, we'll come to it in a second. But I also think that there's a little, if I may, it's a little chutzpah of us in the Jewish community and Israelis to critique a young Irish woman, and I'm going to use the term mansplain because I don't know how else to describe, right? Like, tell her exactly how Irish people should feel about a minority that has been living under occupation by a hostile state for the last 54 years. And that is the reality of the situation in the West Bank. To paraphrase former late Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, himself the grandfather of the settlement movement, he called it kibush in the well of the Knesset. He said, you may not like the word, but this is a kibush, an occupation. That's what it is. It's bad for the Palestinians. It's bad for us. So it's not a serious argument, not that anyone's making it here, to entertain that Israel's not really occupying that territory, although that is the very serious Israeli argument. It's a silly argument, in my opinion. Sally Rooney is, I imagine, a young Irish woman who sees in the Palestinians And the last 54 years of their struggle, or the last 100 years of their struggle, echoes of Irish history, right? There is still one British colony left on the planet, and it's the northern quarter of that island. So I think like people who don't understand a word about Irish history ought to be a little bit more cautious when condemning an Irish author's sympathy for Palestinians. When it comes to the BDS movement, BDS movement is an actual movement founded by actual people, Palestinian NGOs and leaders in the early part of the 21st century that essentially says, let's treat Israel like South Africa was treated until several things are achieved. One of them, that Israel should withdraw to the 67 borders, which a lot of people, myself included, think is a pretty reasonable request. Another thing, Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel should be treated equally, which people like me think is a totally reasonable, hey, I run the New Israel Fund. That's part of why we exist. But the third thing I want to mention that they say is that the Palestinian right of return be realized. And that's where things get tricky, because of course, the Palestinian right of return, if it were to apply to all Palestinians who were kicked out of or fled their homes in 1948 or 1967 and their descendants, would mean that in theory, at least, millions and millions of diasporic Palestinians could come back to Israel, reclaim their homes, and Israel would no longer be a Jewish majority state. Is that a realistic thing? I mean, we're having this conversation in many, many points throughout the diaspora. We haven't all gone back to Israel, despite the existence of the law of return for 70 some odd years. So I doubt it's realistic, but I understand the fear. And it means that the motives, like the BDS folks have had plenty of time to clarify what they mean or what they don't mean. Do they want a two-state solution? Do they not? So there's a lot of concern about that. In addition, there's no doubt that there are people who don't like Jews who are involved in the BDS movement. On the other hand, the Palestinians who founded it don't like Israel. And I think all of us, if we're honest with ourselves for a minute, could understand why they don't like it. And BDS is a nonviolent, right, tactic. Palestinians are told correctly by the world, you can't engage in terrorism and violence. But then they're also told you can't go to international fora like the UN or the International Criminal Courts. They're also told you can't, in many cases, right? You can't practice BDS. That's unacceptable. As of last week, you didn't bring it up, so I will. 2 weeks ago, the defense minister said 6 Palestinian human rights organizations have been labeled terrorist organizations, despite 2 weeks later, the Israelis not actually presenting credible evidence to the US or the EU or anyone, rather circumstantial evidence. So if you're Palestinian and you look at this landscape and you think, so I'm not allowed to call for a boycott of Israel. So again, NIF and I personally don't think those are the right tools, right? Look at the last election. Israel, like our country, politically is on the knife's edge. And I believe in theory and in practice in investing in the peacemakers and the bridge builders rather than divesting. But I understand why Palestinians would support the BDS movement. And I don't think it's inherently anti-Semitic when Palestinians call for it.
So there are 2 other questions that kind of build on this one. So I'm going to ask them together. One is, it seems like every organization and politician has a stance on Israel-Palestine, even when it's irrelevant to their mission. And the questioner says, think environmental groups, Ben and Jerry's, Black Lives Matter. Why do you think that's true? And then the second question, which again is submitted separately, but I think it relates thematically, is how does the Israeli occupation differ from, these are their examples, Russian annexation of Crimea or China, Hong Kong? And we often hear about Turkey and Cyprus in the same kind of question. Why does one elicit a more emotional and intense response? So why does everybody and their mother have something to say on this issue, even if it seems totally separate from their mission? And why does it attract a different kind of attention or passion or emotion than other situations that may, on paper, look pretty similar?
Good 2-part question. It reminds me of a conversation I had with a young Israeli cousin who at the time was serving in an elite Air Force commando unit. Super smart guy, lovely person, NIF supporter. And he said sure, genuinely, he wasn't trying to have a fight. He said, why did people, he didn't talk about Hong Kong. He talked about what I believe to be an even better example because of the age of this occupation, Tibet, right? He said, how come people are so infuriated and impassioned about our occupation, which he said, I don't agree with it. but no one says a word about Tibet. And I said, well, first of all, people do say a word about Tibet. But second of all, here's the big difference between Israel and China, like 1.4 billion people, right? So the fact is, and of course, there are many more dimensions to it. I know I'm answering the second part first, but there's a related set of answers, I think, that inform both parts of the question. And that is China, which occupies Tibet and now Hong Kong, and Russia and the Crimea, they are not the largest recipient of US aid in the whole wide world for the last however many decades.
Yeah.
They are not a country neither country presents itself as Or LaGoyim, the light unto the nations. Neither one claims to be a liberal democracy, and neither one claims that the United States is its best friend and protector, and neither of them are associated nations of the European Union, Israel's largest trading partner. Right?
I'd add one more. Neither of them contain the holy city that is the most important place for the three major religions in the world.
100%. I was coming to that as a separate category.
Sorry.
But no, you did it. So we don't have to, you did it more succinctly than I would.
I
right?
mean, and I also usually, when I answer this question, add, I think the military aid, I mean, I often get asked, why do journalists spend so much time on this? In addition to the military aid, I mean, from the Jewish community perspective, there's also no place that draws as much philanthropic investment. And,
right.
So there's many ways in which we are over invested in this place, emotionally, spiritually, financially, philanthropically. And so the idea that we would also be over invested in our kind of political debate or journalistic resources doesn't seem to me to be out of kilter with those other things.
No, I think that's right. And I mean, and when we get into the whole question about, like, you mentioned, the religious aspect, and there are a lot of people, a lot of religious Americans who are fundamentalist in their outlook towards religion and believe that, right, the words of the Bible, whether that for you is the Hebrew scriptures or both the old and new, as they say, like there are people for whom that is the word of God, Jews, but also many, many Christians. And, the largest Zionist organization in America, or I should say the largest organization that's part of the Israel lobby in America, is CUFI, Christians United for Israel. So it has become, as a result of this very interesting and I think really important to understand growing strain of dispensationalist evangelical Christian fundamentalism, right, or Christian Zionists. The former Secretary of State and the former Vice President were proud leaders they were proud, self-identified Christian Zionists. Like, this has become central to our politics. And for one of the two political parties, it's become a litmus test. And, the dispensationalist, fundamentalist evangelical Christians don't believe that you should support Israel no matter what an Israeli government does. Thus, the fury of one of their major leaders when Naftali Bennett replaced Netanyahu. And let's keep one thing straight, folks. Bennett is to Bibi's right on a host of issues. But because he was, the prime minister designate of a coalition government that included parties of the right, left, center, and Arab sector in Israel, this guy went, crazy at the idea that Bibi would be replaced, because Christian Zionism doesn't see an Israel that achieves a two-state solution as desirable. Israel, they are territorially maximalist. So all of this warps the discourse in the American political scene, where one party makes it a litmus test and weaponizes it as a cudgel with which to beat the other political party. And now we see in the other political party people who are identifying because of, I believe, the intersectional moment in our politics. That's a word that gets overused sometimes. But on the one hand, you can understand why people who are involved with racial justice issues here would see parallels there. They're not always the same parallels that they see.
Yeah. So we have just a late breaking question that Jackie just surfaced to me, which is why, given if some of the reasons that Israel-Palestine draws more attention than Russia-Crimea, how come there's not more passion around the U.S. occupation of Native American land, is how the questioner put it. And I think, and there's another question, and I want to actually, I'm going to ask you to be tight. I have a couple of really quick lightning rounds to come, but because some people are also asking about like the litmus test that has been sort of created on the left around this issue, that if you want to be in a leftist space, you have to be X, Y, or Z around this issue. So super quick on those two very complicated questions.
We're human beings, and we're hypocritical, and we have amnesia. And the fact is, what we did in this continent and what other people who look like many of us on this call did in places like, in Canada, in the States, and Australia, it was much more horrific than what the Israelis did in the late 19th, early 20th century, as challenging as that history is to wrestle with. But why don't we care about that? Because we're hypocrites, right? Like we don't, it's what the questioner raises an important question, which should, I believe, not obviate concern people have for the welfare of Palestinians and what the establishment of the state of Israel, which I believe was just and necessary, has wrought, which is much injustice and pain and sorrow. Like it shouldn't obviate the fact that we're, our history is horrific. But like, so my pithy answer for that one is like my cousin. Here it's 200 years. That's the difference, or 300 years. Yeah. As for, look, the Sunrise Movement is a great example of how things have gone out of control, also on the left. Now, again, I'm going to argue that it's a troubling and challenging thing, especially for many of us who find ourselves, readers of the Forward, donors to the NIF, people who would drift, who would come to Sixth and I and other places like Sixth and I. We tend to be, not all of us, right, progressive, liberal American Jews. And so it's particularly painful to see this happening on what we think is our side of the political divide. But, the point of the book is that people have strong opinions about which they really know nothing. And the people of Sunrise, DC, I think would fit into that category from what I've seen.
Yeah, and to their credit, they did apologize. I really have to say, I like the alliteration of this subtitle, but I feel like the bonkers thing would have been, why are people so bonkers about such a small country, would have been great. Okay, I think I have two questions that require one-word answers. I believe the easy question of the night will be a great question. No offense to the questioner. What kind of trip would you recommend for someone who has never been to Israel and is interested in all sides of the conflict?
No joke. You should go on a New Israel Fund tour, and then you should spend a few days with the organization Encounter in the West Bank.
I thought you were just going to say Encounter, but okay. I guess I should have been.
You teed me up.
Realized that. Yeah. So the New Israel Fund will show you a lot of stuff within Israel of people working on all sorts of bridge building, and then Encounter will take you into Palestinian homes and communities and let you hear directly from Palestinians in the West Bank.
Yeah, and you'll fall in love with everybody, which is the beautiful thing.
And I'm going to ask for a one-word answer here from a question from Lou. Do you agree that the two-state solution is dead, killed by all the settlements, and Bennett's calling it dead?
Not yet. It's
That's 2 words. I said one word. Okay.
Anyway, well, then no.
No. Okay, good. And then this is a great question. What is something both of you, meaning you and me, originally thought about Israel that you had to change your mind about or learn a truth about? And I'm going to encourage people who've spent a lot of time there to also post their own answers to that in the chat. So just again, I'll put the question actually in because it's a really good question. Although I think that Jackie okay, here we go. We're doing the high tech thing. Anyway, Daniel, what is something that you thought about Israel and had to change your mind about or learn a truth about?
Well, this is something I learned a truth about a long, long time ago when I was a teenager. But and it's so obvious that it doesn't even, whatever. But you asked, I learned that Israel wasn't the country that was portrayed in Leon Uris's Exodus. Right. I learned that it was a real place, and that led to a more sophisticated learning later in life, which was very liberating, which is that you can love a place and a people without supporting the policies and politics of the government of that place and people at a given time.
Sounds like how half the country feels about this country all the time. So
what about you?
So I was really surprised I wish that this answer wasn't going to sound so negative, because I mean, I love this place and I loved all the people that I worked with on both sides of the Green Line. And it was a great place to do journalism, and I love so many things about it. But the most striking, I think, thing that fits this question is just the open racism, for lack of a better word, that is rooted in actual experience, continues to be shocking to me, and just the most important thing to understand. So here in this country, I always use this example, but I think it's really true. So, sometimes in this country, people, including like Eric Holder, an African-American man, have written about like that fear you have, and maybe you cross the street when it's at night and you might see a Black man in a hoodie, and it is based on a fantasy, a fiction, a comic book sense. It's the person who is crossing the street, who is afraid, has never been mugged by, almost never, this is just based on some stereotype racist imagery. And what I found among Israeli Jews and among Palestinians was like much more openness of it to say, these people are awful based on their identity. But it was rooted in like, I hate Arabs because my cousin was killed in a bus bombing. I hate Jews because the soldier stops my kid on the way to school and takes his soccer ball. I mean, it was like it's super openly race-based or identity-based kind of stereotyping, but rooted in an experience that happened yesterday to somebody that they really know and love. And so I found that like getting that was really helped me understand the place, but it was different than anything I'd experienced. And I will say also on the Jewish side, the Israeli Jewish side, the openness of that kind of stereotyping among Jews between Orthodox Haredi and Chiloni was also kind of striking and surprising. I mean, just the fact that they have separate school systems for Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, Arab, and secular was a total surprise to me, and feels like a really key to understanding how complicated and sort of troubling some things about it are.
That's a good answer. And I mean, it's funny because I know we don't have time for this, but like, I'd love to talk to you more about it because, here you are, the Jerusalem bureau chief. And I mean, maybe because our generation is our generation and we grew up in this country when we grew up, it felt more removed, what Eric Holder said. Or maybe it's because like living in California or New Jersey or New York is different than living in Mississippi or other parts of the world or in the in South LA or in Oakland. But like, I think that like what you made me think of was how proximate everything is there.
Yeah.
Like people are always shocked when I say, Bethlehem is next door to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
You can walk there.
I mean, people are real. Yeah. I also think, I have to say what you said about your cousin, and this doesn't quite fit the frame of the question, but the adolescence of the place, the youth of the place, I think you just have to keep telling yourself over and over and over again. I mean, it's like, imagine covering America in 1840,
Yeah.
I mean, I have no idea what that would have been like, but that's what I was doing.
But I think that's an important insight, Jody. I am working in a country that is 70 years old.
Yeah, it's like I mean, think about your kids and like, okay, here's our last question. And I think this is meant by our question organizer. Thank you so much, Jackie. You did an amazing job. I think this is meant to leave our audience with some hope, and I know you are the uniquely qualified person to answer this question. So, who are some of the current Israeli and Palestinian leaders who you think are leading us towards peace?
Well, it's funny you should ask that question, Jody, because the last chapter in the book is called The Case for Hope. And it's the last chapter for a reason, not only because you need it after reading the other part of the book, but because I have to try to impress upon everyone, my readers and the people on this call, that the best antidote to despair, right? The best cure for pessimism and the loss of hope is just getting out there amongst those people. And there's tens of thousands of them who are the social justice and civil rights movement in Israel, right? Jews and Arabs alike, as well as also folks in the Palestinian territories. But there's, as Heschel said, right? Like or to paraphrase him, once you're there, you see that there's no there's no time for despair. There's too much work to be done. And so I end the book with the stories of three of my friends, people who have done amazing things. There's Maysam Jaljuli, an Arab Israeli woman whose formative moment was witnessing Meir Kahane, the racist and violent inciter, and his followers try to come to her Arab village, and witnessing thousands of Israelis from nearby towns coming to stand shoulder to shoulder with the villagers to sort of be a human wall to, as she said, prevent not only the person of Kahane, but also the idea of Kahanism from infecting and terrifying the Arab residents of the country. And as she's gone on, as things have gotten worse, right, politically and socially between Arabs and Jews, she's held on to this image, and it inspires her work today as an activist, that image of what could be. And then there's Mutassim Ali, who I write about, who's neither Jewish nor Arab. He's a Sudanese refugee. In fact, the first sub-Saharan African refugee, the first person to receive political asylum in Israel, a non-Jew who got political asylum in Israel when he fled the genocide in Darfur. Why? Because they had been told that Jewish congregations in America had been active against the genocide in Darfur, the Save Darfur moment. So those of you who were involved, you should know this had a real impact on this young man who walked to Israel thinking a Jewish country will take me in because they care about us, and spent years in detention camps, fighting through the legal system, finally got his freedom and got political asylum, went to law school, and is now a lawyer for political asylum seekers and immigrants in Israel, inspired, he says, by Israel's Declaration of Independence, right? And then finally, Gadi Gavaryan.
I know Mutassim, and I've read and stuff a lot about him, and I didn't know the part of the story that was in your book about his specific calling out of Jews' activism on Darfur as a motivator. And it was interesting because this just came up for me. We just did a story about, why Jews aren't more active around the Uyghurs, and people were specifically talking about Darfur as this model. So I was really struck by that. And here's a profile in the chat of Mutassim, and keep going. Beautiful. On your third.
Well done. Yeah. When he told me that, I was speechless. And then the third person is a guy called Gadi Gavaryahu, who founded a group called Tag Ma'ir, which means light tag in Hebrew. And it's a play on words on Tag Machir, which is a settler extremist terror group, price tag, they call themselves. And light tag was founded during Hanukkah, thus the light. And what price tag does is it attacks Palestinians, Arab Israelis, peace activists, increasingly even IDF folks, when they feel that any aspect of the settlement enterprise has been in any way thwarted or restrained at all. And ultimately, this, of course, as it had to do, worked its way up to murder. Price tag terrorists were the people who kidnapped and murdered the Arab boy in the Jerusalem forest. There's, I think, a Netflix or an HBO series about this horrific event. In response to these attacks, this guy Gadi formed light tag. And at first it was religious Jews who would go to sites of attacks in Palestinian villages or Arab towns within Israel and say, we're standing in solidarity with you. After the horrific terror attack on the synagogue in Har Nof in Jerusalem, where Palestinian terrorists murdered Jews at prayer, some of the people who Gadi had visited called him up and said, we would like to make a solidarity visit to these folks in Har Nof, who welcomed them, just as the Palestinians had welcomed these religious Jews. Thus, Light Tag was born, and it is now an interfaith group of Jews, Christians, and Muslims who go to stand in solidarity and say, not in our name, when there are incidents of sectarian terrorism and violence. And you have to be a much harder-hearted person than I am to know these three people and not think there is hope for the future of this place.
Well, thank you so much. That is a great way to end this conversation, as well as the book. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you so much to Heather and Jackie for having us and hosting us and doing such an excellent job with all of the logistics. Here's the book again. You have a special offer to buy an autographed copy, which I think Heather has come back on the screen to tell you more about. And you're going to receive, I believe in your email, a copy of the video, but I'll let Heather take it from here. Thank you, Daniel, for such a great conversation. And thank you to the audience for such excellent questions and comments in the chat. It was my privilege to be here. I hope you all do sign up for the Forwards newsletters and support us so that we can have more conversations like this that the community needs so badly.
Thank you all. Thank you, Jody. That was great.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Jody. Thank you both so much for such an incredible conversation. Please, please buy the book. We bought the book for everyone at Six and I on the staff who wanted to read it. It's an extraordinary book. The link to purchase the books, the autograph books, is in the chat box. And we're also going to email the link to everyone as well. We'll have more virtual events coming up. Many of our in-person events have a virtual component. So however you feel most comfortable, we hope you'll come back and see us again soon. You can check out our calendar at sixandI.org. And until then, take care and have a great night.